Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last plenary session of World Economic Forum this year in Istanbul. I'm glad to see that enthusiasm is still clearly high, and we'll just start now and hope that some more people join us as we go on. As you know, we're here to discuss the role of the military and the rule of law in this extraordinarily large region that the World Economic Forum is addressing. We're going to be taking two angles. One is what is the role, and which countries does it play a deciding factor in politics? And secondly, how can the rule of law and the institutions that support it be strengthened? Our program talks of select countries very discreetly, looking around this region about which countries it can be said that the military plays a truly political role. Probably it comes down to two, Turkey and Pakistan, in which there have been clear interventions in politics frequently. But if we take in the Middle East as well, we can see that military structures have a big part to play in countries like Egypt, Syria, Algeria, Libya. And if we take military a bit more broadly as including security apparatuses, then a lot of former Soviet countries obviously also include. So we'll be discussing the lines between these, I expect. And to do this, we have four very distinguished speakers with us, and very different perspectives from Europe, from the United States, from NATO, and from a country in the region, Armenia. And to start us off, I think we'll be doing 3 to 5 minute presentations each, just to get the ball rolling in this conversation. And then we'll throw it open to the floor to see which points you'd like to take up and go on with. And right to start with, I'd like to turn to Monsieur Jacques Barrot, who is the Vice President of the European Commission in charge of freedom, justice, and security. Responsibilities which make you uniquely qualified to address this subject. And perhaps you'll be addressing issues such as where to draw the line between military and security forces confronting terrorism and the defense of human rights. And of course, we'll all be listening very carefully to what you say, since we all know that there is, as part of the European Union enlargement process, Turkey is negotiating with the European Union, and in 4 days' time there will be another progress report in which the question of civilian-military relations and the rule of law always plays a very important role. So, Monsieur Barrot, the floor is yours.
The traditional role of the army to defend national sovereignty has been expanded. Ensuring defense and security means more than just military defense of territories. The military is required to provide temporary support to civil authorities, as providing law enforcement actions, ensuring public order, assisting in the fight against terrorism, providing humanitarian aid support. And the army has a key role in providing support in peacekeeping operations. The army provides international humanitarian assistance. And I think that the army can still provide a way of integrating social classes, of teaching society discipline values. My personal experience as soldier in Algeria was focused on bringing help to local population. And 40 years after, I have kept links with the village where I was posted. But the army has to respect the rule of law. The rule of law sets out standards which are based on separation of powers, on fundamental rights. Systems are needed to ensure that the military do not go beyond their remit. And the military have to respect the following, on my view, the following 3 principles. The military should be subject to the civil authorities and the common rules of the institution. Parliament's control over the military, including the military budget, is an essential principle of democracy. Second, the military should minimize acts of violence. It is necessary for gaining support from the local population. The military should always think about the potential for cooperation with an opposition force which will become allies. Three, the military should be exemplary in the action they take. If they abuse, they provoke hatred in the heart of the people. It is essential that we have an independent judiciary system to control the use of force. NGO, international organization, public opinion are calling for the same rules. And the respect for the rule of law is very important in the enlargement processes for the European Union. It is a key criteria needed for new countries to join the EU. We look carefully at the so-called Copenhagen political criteria. Respect for the rule of law, human rights, and protection of minorities, and the military have to play their role in this context. The use of force must be adapted to the threat in order to maintain the lowest possible level of violence and to create the condition of the peace. Getting the support of population is necessary to win in the wars of the future. It's my little remarks.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Barrot. That was very interesting. A call to define the role of the military clearly, that it should, the peacekeeping, national security, terrorism, a social role even. That was very interesting about how that applies to the village that you were with. And yes, juridical oversight and a question of the rule of law. In Turkey right now, we have in fact a problem, as everyone knows, for the last 2 years. We've had considerable unrest based on the question of the military's role. But the trouble is that it seems that there are 3 groups involved. One is supposedly the people who represent the law as the Turkish Grand National Assembly. However, just a few days ago, the Constitutional Court published a ruling in which it said that no, in some cases, the Constitutional Court decides what the content of the law is going to be. And finally, of course, there's a third institution, the Turkish Armed Forces, who also claim legitimacy to guard the current state of affairs in Turkey according to the Constitution, which handily enough they wrote themselves in 1982. So a very confusing picture, and luckily to elucidate us further and perhaps show us the way ahead is Grenville Byford, who's an entrepreneur who has seen the light and turned to the mightier pen. And Grenville, the name you have is one of former Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. If you were the Secretary of State of the United States, you're now from America, what would you be advising him to do in places like Turkey and beyond in order to make sure that the right choice is made between a pliable ally who's in charge of a tightly secure state and or a state where perhaps more is done for the people and where the people might disagree strongly with the United States policy?
You know, for one delightful moment, Hugh, I thought you were going to remark that the pen is mightier than the checkbook. I'm not
I know
sure
that
that's
not
true.
to be true. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you should mention the Turkish army in the context of building democracy, because I think that nothing illustrates the schizophrenic attitude of American administrations towards supporting Democrats than the response to the e-memorandum, which you'll recall essentially threatened a coup if Abdullah Gül became president. On the one hand, President Bush, and he is not the first, talks a great game about supporting democracy. He made a long speech about it at the World Economic Forum in Sharm el-Sheikh, a speech that was greeted with stony silence, because stony silence is the wages of hypocrisy. The problem the United States has got itself into is we talk about our principles in ringing declarative tones, and the moment we're asked to take a side which might put us against a powerful interest group, in this case the Turkish army, we retreat to weasel words like, "we don't take sides." In fact, it took a week for the United States government to join the European Union in supporting Turkish democracy, the result of which we made enemies all round, which I would have said was precisely the definition of bad diplomacy. But I think the truth is that the United States cannot do a great deal to build democratic institutions. For one thing, anything we do support tends to be tainted by the belief that we're doing it for our own reasons. Building liberal democracy has in fact got to be done by the people who will live under it. What I believe we can do, however, is support those governments who wish to build democratic institutions and withhold our support from those who don't. But there is a serious trade-off between our principles and our interests. And I think we've made a historic mistake in not making this explicit. We have not made it consistently, and we have not explained what we're doing and why. So with this in mind, Mr. President, I'd like to propose 6 rules that we should consider when we think about the issue of helping build liberal democracies and the institutions that make them work. Rule 1, don't talk out of both sides of your mouth. It only leads to the sort of reaction that now greets President Bush. Yes, we support democracy. Yes, we abhor tyranny. But there are times when our interests will require us to do business with oppressive regimes. We do ourselves no good, and we do nobody else any good, by raising people's hopes only to dash them. The world needs to understand that the United States has its own interests to protect, just like everybody else. Yes, because we're powerful and because we're rich, we can occasionally afford to behave altruistically. Not always, however, and not for a long time, not for long. Rule 2, don't connive at regime change. There are many obnoxious regimes, and getting rid of them is very satisfying. The law of unintended consequences, however, lurks around every corner. Think of the mess that toppling the Islamic courts of Somalia has now created. And from time to time, the United States will have to deal, and should deal, with truly obnoxious people. I'm thinking of the North Koreans. Publicly wishing them gone simply does not help. Now, turning to some more palatable rules. Rule 3, don't get too far on the wrong side of the people. We do not want to be the ugly Americans propping up unpopular regimes. We may do this sometimes. There are always exceptions. But we'd better have a very good reason, because sooner or later it tends to blow up in our face. Think of the Shah's Iran in 1979 and everything that has gone afterwards. And I do, of course, realize that should we apply this rule, it will be a dramatic departure from precedent. Rule 4, politics exists even in autocracies. If regime change happens and the new guys say the right things, well, yes, of course, let's support them. But military regimes and other autocracies have a limited shelf life for the same reason that democratically elected governments do. They get tired, and their people get tired of them. We've got to make sure that we explain that our support is of limited duration, that it is conditioned upon the new guys implementing the reforms they talk about, and that we will not support them if they lose the support of their own people. See Rule 3 above. Rule 5, don't panic. New democracies will do things we don't like. They will backslide on commitments to things like human rights and women's rights, probably because the leaders feel it is politically expedient. That does not mean we should rush to withdraw our support or look for some useful general. Sweden, after all, did not become Sweden overnight. Finally, Rule 6, don't destabilize democratic governments by asking them to do the politically impossible. We Americans have a long and unfortunate habit of ignoring the fact that other people have politics too. When we asked the Turkish government to permit the transit of the 4th Infantry Division to northern Iraq, we conveniently ignored the fact that 80% of the Turkish people simply loathed the idea. We did nothing to change their mind or to help the Turkish government change their minds. I mean, the truth is that no American president would send legislation to Congress if the polls told him 80% of Americans hated it. And then there are a couple of operational issues that I think we characteristically do not handle well. One of them is we should talk to the NGOs. The United States government may not accept the policy prescriptions of the NGOs, but we should recognize that NGOs frequently know things that we don't and should. Secondly, people who ask for our help do not do so in the Oval Office. They're characteristically not invited. Instead, they talk to Colonel Jones or Deputy Chief of Mission Smith. And I believe that past administrations have done a simply rotten job of ensuring that middle-ranking bureaucrats and military officers understand what it is the President will and will not support. Because the injunction not to speak out of both sides of your mouth doesn't merely apply to the President of the United States, it applies to the collective mouth of the United States government. And hypocrisy is simply not attractive. So I don't believe that those rules will help a president determine every complex issue that comes across his desk. Diplomacy, after all, is not like theoretical physics. It's not controlled by a set of unchanging equations. I do believe, however, if we were to follow these rules, that we would avoid some of the mistakes that previous administrations have made.
Thanks very much. Clearly a very idealistic Secretary of State, Grenville. I think,
we have a new administration, Hugh.
Yes, well, you're on their list, clearly. You've talked about theoretical physics, but I think we're very lucky to have someone who has real experience on the ground of how to fit all these very complicated ideals with the reality of running a country. We have here with us today Dr. Armen Sarkissian, former Prime Minister of Armenia, and also the former head of Department of Computer Modeling of Complex Systems at Yerevan University's Department of Theoretical Physics, and a noted academic. And we'd be really interested to hear what your perspective is on how to fit these various idealistic views and how this really works in practice, and especially from your perspective as an expert on the political geography of Eurasia, that means the former Soviet Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, I'll try to share with my experience. When I was thinking about these rules, 6 of them, I thought, is it enough 6? Maybe we have to go for the 7th and the 8th and the 9th. Probably one of the rules that are very important is that, I will formulate that, have knowledge and respect to the local history and culture. and try to understand it deeply before you even think of going into diplomatic relations rather than military action and so on. So from that point of view, I think history teaches us a lot. And I would like to go to the region that I come from, which is Eurasia. Let's take a part of that, which is the former Soviet Union. And since we are speaking about the role of the military, I would like to share with you basically a general observation about the role of military and also the security forces. Traditionally, culturally, inside of Russian Empire and then former Soviet Union, the role of the military was always suppressed by the power, and the role of the security forces brought up. And if we go back to the beginning of the formation of Soviet Union, when the Bolshevik regime took over the place, basically they tried not to change many things. They kept the army, but put the red flag and a commissar to run it. And they took over the Imperial Intelligence Service and sent a couple of guys with red ideas, like Mr. Comrade Dzerzhinsky, to make out of that the new KGB of it. During the whole history of former Soviet Union, the political power never trusted the military. So there was cleaning of military sort of vigorously for several times. First in 1937, when the Bolshevik leadership decided that they already have their Red Army officers that were trained with the ideology of communism, so they can get rid of the old sort of Russian nationalistic generals. And then after the Second World War, where the glorious Red Army was becoming very powerful, Joseph Stalin did everything to diminish the role of the leaders of the army, including Marshal Zhukov and others. So this was always a struggle internally between the power and the military, but the power was always using the secret service, i.e. the KGB, to be their strong partner. So that created a sort of a tradition in the region. And if you look at the region, which is the former Soviet Union, most of the former Soviet republics, including Russian Federation, when you look at the structure of power, when President Putin came to power, he looked for infrastructure, political infrastructure that can again integrate and basically help him to gain control over disintegrating state of Russian Federation. And that power was definitely not the army, but the intelligence service. So when we speak about the role of the army, probably what Mr. Barrot was saying about the principles of behavior of the army, there should be also principles of behavior for the security forces as well. So in many of our republics, including, as I said, Russia, Central Asian republics, including Caucasus, the role of the security forces has great importance, and they can be a very strong player, both internal politics, but also have their influence on the external one. The second thing that I would like to mention here is about the indirect role of not military, but military-related politicians, specifically in the countries that are in conflict. It's obvious that all wars create veterans, and all wars also create veterans that come back to powers as well with some experience and military, and that's a great advantage for a politician, and it can be used during the election campaign and so on and so forth. And in many cases, smaller countries, when you have a conflict or a long-term conflict, creates a sort of a clan of people, I would call it a political clan of people, that have been involved in the conflict and have been sort of rewarded as military leaders. So the next step they use that in order to come to power. And then they become a force, a conservative force that will oppose any sort of a liberalization of the society internally, and they'll become a force that will be sort of opposing any sort of a compromises, political, with the neighbor or with the other conflict inside. I don't want to give specific names of the countries, but I think you can guess. So when politicians with a military background come, they bring with them not the infrastructure, but the mentality and also the political force of that. So this is second thing that it's important to say for me. And the third one, we were discussing on one of our panels with Mr. Simmons as well about the future of the region and how we can just try to resolve issues. At the end of the day, one of my personal conclusions and the things that I've I was thinking I have learned more is that probably the model at the end of the day is the model of the European Union. Not to join immediately physically European institutions, but to have the ideas of European Union, the experience of European Union that had lived in different wars and have the experience of controlling and not controlling the army and having all of these huge conflicts all over Europe in specific historic events and years have managed to come to a completely different structure where state boundaries exist, but there are more other boundaries, which are the cultural exchange, economic connectivities, and so on. So the world is sort of more virtually different, the map of Europe, rather than physical boundaries of states. So it will have also implication of the behavior of the military and the security forces if we adopt that sort of attitude in our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armen. I absolutely agree in the power of the European Union to digest and make people feel safe to move towards non-securitized policies. And we've seen that in Turkey as well. And indeed, you've raised three very interesting issues there, which we can surely discuss later. And then I would like to turn for some opening remarks to our last speaker, Robert Simmons, who's the Deputy Assistant for the NATO Secretary General for Security, Cooperation and Partnership for most of the world, as far as I can see. It's Russia, Central Asia, and most of the former Soviet space, and Pakistan. And obviously, another completely different perspective on the question of military relations. Obviously, NATO engaging with the former Central Asian states. We're fascinated to hear what you have to say about how NATO can help us move towards a rule of law in all these countries.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say that I will descend to the most level of pragmatism, because what I want to do is outline some of the steps that NATO has done in order to help defense reform in these countries, because we believe that a good basis for defense reform, and we've worked on it very solidly with the 10 countries that have joined the alliance, the 2 that are now in the process of having their membership ratified, to bring about a process of defense reform that does really change the basis of both the structure of the military and its role in society. And I would argue we've been reasonably successful. I will, at least in my opening remarks, concentrate on the countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia. I'm the Secretary General's Special Representative for those reasons. And again, military reform, because we are a security alliance, has been one of the major features. Let me state 3 general points in the beginning, and they go along with what my colleagues have said. First of all, and I think that's a positive development, unlike, say, the Latin American model, the military have usually not directly interfered in the Caucasus and Central Asia in the government apparatus. They haven't performed coups and things like that. That doesn't mean that, as Mr. Sarkissian said, that the Minister of Defense is not a powerful political leader and his support is necessary in periods of transition and all the rest of it. But there isn't a history in these countries, and that's positive, of directly interfering in the political process. The second, and others have mentioned it as well, when you talk about military forces, you can't limit yourself only to those in the classical Ministry of Defense. Most of these countries have militarized units in ministries of the interior, ministries of the national security, and border guards, just to name a few of the models, but there's a range of them. And when you talk about defense reform, you clearly have to include these in the picture, because their forces are important and often are the ones more inclined to involve themselves. What have been the tools that NATO has used? And again, I will be very pragmatic in this. And we do have an experience, because 10 countries have joined the alliance. In our own, what we call the MAP process, to bring these countries in the alliance, defense reform, bringing these countries to the model that NATO has for its own countries of defense activities, has been a critical aspect. First, of course, is interoperability, that at least some units, and for countries seeking to join the alliance, all of the units must have a capability of working with other countries' forces. And I would argue that that is a very critical aspect, that in fact the notion not only of concentrating on your own defense, but also working with other countries is a critical aspect of developing a different sense, a more modern, a more reformed sense of the military. In that context, you must look at issues like the structure of the the Ministry of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the relations between them, but also, as others in the panel have cited, how they relate to other functions, particularly civil emergency planning. Is the military capable of dealing with a disaster and things like that? The second stage is that we find it's important for the military, as part of a political process, not in isolation, to develop a national security strategy, to have a basis for making the judgments about budgets, personnel, structure of the military. These should not be based, and I often use the colloquial expression, as the last colonel through the Minister of Defense office takes the bag of money and runs off with it. There should be a basis in planning for making the judgments about it. And that's a very critical and often very difficult step connected with that. Out of that then comes developing a process and a civilian process for budgeting, for the structure of the forces, and for the structure of the cadres. Developing, for many of these countries, a more pyramidical structure in the armed forces, reducing the number of officers, developing a non-commissioned officers cadre, and having a structure that is more compatible with other countries, and particularly with the countries of the alliance. Finally, and out of this, and I think that's a critical aspect, and all of these features contribute to it, is that the process must be more transparent. We, like my colleague from the European Union, believe that there should be civilian control of the armed forces. Sometimes that's translated just into having a civilian defense minister. And while I guess that's good, it's broader than that. It is that the process is transparent enough that parliamentarians can digest it. Even in our own countries, military budgets can be a pretty hard thing for the best of parliamentarians to deal with. And in fact, it's important that the process, and out of this planning, out of a solid budget process, in fact, it is more transparent to the parliamentarians. Secondly, it's developing a cadre of civilian experts within the ministry who are budget experts, personnel experts. That's not to say, and even within alliance countries the models vary, that the military can't play some role in this, but in fact developing a cadre of civilian employees trained in their disciplines to carry this forward is an important process of the reform. So again, I've been very pragmatic, but in what we call the individual partnership action plans, we have worked with our partners, all three Caucasus countries, Kazakhstan, but also in the beginning stages with the countries, other countries of Central Asia, to develop the kind of steps along the lines I've outlined that we believe as very basic, very pragmatic steps, and I said I was going to be very pragmatic, take these countries down along a process of defense reform based on our own experience and based particularly on the experience of our new allies that lay, if you will, the groundwork, the building blocks for the kind of political reform my colleagues have talked about. Because I think with these bases, you can in fact take the process forward, and that's really the goal and the goal of our own cooperation with these countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. That was an impressive tour de force. We've stayed very much on a high plane of ideals and general principles about militaries and civilian rule and rule of law. And I'd like to, perhaps at this point, just start off with a specific question for you, Bob, about how, for instance, we've just seen a transition in one of the countries of this region, in Pakistan, from a very military-dominated regime to an apparently civilian one. How can this process be supported as a matter of practical, as a practical matter?
Well, again, Pakistan is not one of our partners in the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, Partnership for Peace, but we do seek and have had over a period of time, going back to our assistance with the earthquake which took place in Kashmir 3 years ago now, we have developed an increasing relationship with that country. I can say that NATO welcomes the transition to a democratic government. It's interesting, and I was stationed in Pakistan, when the two basic political parties have maintained elections on their own, most people, I think, acknowledge that they have reasonable and democratic elections that are free and fair. What follows is often the problem. We have said that we want, in fact, and the Secretary General is prepared to go to Islamabad and meet with the new government, a good and constructive relation, yes, that deals with our cooperation with Afghanistan, but also deals with other aspects of a broader political dialogue and perhaps assistance with Pakistan along the lines I indicated that we have with other partners. I think, and my own experience in Pakistan indicates, that the relation between the military and the civilian government is critical, and it's no secret also elements within the military, particularly ISI and the role it plays. And I think the Pakistanis themselves, and that's important, have, perhaps using some of the tools I outlined, have a better understanding of how these institutions play together and work together. And I think that would be a critical first step.
So a step forward in Pakistan. I'd like to now open it up to the floor for some questions. I do ask if you could please state your name and affiliation, and keep the questions short and to the point. Thank you very much. I recognize the... Yes, please.
Sinan Ülgen from EDAM, a think tank based in Istanbul. I have a question to Bob Simmons. I was interested to hear when you outlined the fact that NATO on the PFP was helping countries to establish a body of civilian competence within the ministries of defense. Now, obviously that's very important, but for many of those countries, including countries that are not under PFP but certainly members of NATO, another important dimension of the civilian oversight of military budgets is to establish a body of civilian competence outside the government. Because in many of those countries, opposition parties cannot rely actually on government resources. And they have to be able to rely on this type of civilian competence that is outside the limit of the government, namely in civil society. What is the NATO point of view on that? Namely, are you doing anything as far as NATO in trying to establish these type of civilian pools outside government influence, even in NATO countries and not only in NATO PFP countries?
Well, as I said, I think that is a critical aspect of it. Our concentration first and foremost has been with the Parliament, both government and opposition. And we, working with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, an independent but close partner of ours, have run what we call Rose-Ross seminars. They are seminars which try to develop the expertise among parliamentarians and their staffs, and I think having a good staff and parliamentarians is a good thing, to digest the material we produced. I think the base with planning, with clearer budgets is an important first step, but you must have people, as you say, in the civilian sector, but in the parliaments that can digest, that are educated enough to do this. We are actually planning, we were planning and we are still planning to hold such a seminar in Pakistan itself coming up. I think if you develop and begin the training for a cadre of such officials within the Defense Ministry, you will develop the schools and the places where people can study these. Obviously, there have to be institutions, NGOs and things like that, that can make use and employ these people. But I think if you begin to develop this cadre, and that's happened in the new members of the alliance, you do develop this expertise. And I agree with you, it must go through Parliament, through NGOs, through the non-governmental sector, but also the Ministry of Defenses as well.
Thanks very much. Any more questions? Perhaps then I could turn to Monsieur Barrot again and have your view on how to reconcile the question of you yourself have been involved in counterinsurgency operations in Algeria, and you have an enlargement candidate very close to the European Union whose main priority is defeating an insurgency in its own country. Do you see that how would you advise Turkey to approach this while maintaining a balance between the rule of law and the military?
I think that it's absolutely necessary to respect the human rights. Because I was in Algeria, I fought against some French militaries who used violence against the suspects. And I think that it is absolutely necessary to submit the military power to the judiciary power. Because for us, sorry, my English is not very, very fluent.
It's excellent.
But for us, the most important thing in the democracy is the independence of judiciary power. It's very, very important. It's a key for the entrance the new member states. It's very important, and I am in charge of this monitoring about the judiciary power. It's very, very important to have an independent and also competent power for justice. It's very, very important. It's a key element. I am not sure that in all the member states of EU we have obtained this independent and very competent power yet. And I am happy to see all the progress in Turkey. But I have said to the minister, to the foreign minister, that it's for us, it's very, very important to see the progress of a judiciary power. It's very important. And if military will accept this judiciary power, I think that is a very good step for the admission of Turkey in EU.
Thanks very much. That's very clear. Any remarks from the floor? Yes, the lady with the white shirt.
Talking about the military, Yaprak Özer from Turkey. Talking about the military and the role it has. I'd like any of the panelists give us a definition of defense and security. I think there is a problem with that. Where does security end? Where does defense end or start? Could they elaborate on this, the definitions for the new geographies and new politics, since we're talking about what we are going to be actually dealing with the military's role in the future in politics, and so it's interrelated, I think.
So you mean the difference between internal security and external defense?
No. What is defense and what is security? If we're talking about military's role in politics and politics' role in military, I am curious about the definition that we have of the two, of this, the words and what it means actually. If they can elaborate it around this region, I would be glad to.
Sure. Does anyone want to jump into that one?
Well, I'll start the ball rolling. I think in terms of inside a country, the military is the ultimate guarantor that the government has a monopoly on the use of force. And the challenge, I think, in building a liberal democracy is to build institutions to resolve conflict that will result in that guarantee never, in fact, being called. I think the challenge in dealing with internal unrest and what people like to call terrorism these days, although I'm never quite sure what the definition is that really it's a police problem. It's not a military problem in any classical sense. The military is supposed to be ensuring the sanctity of the borders in that role. But I think the challenge is in fact to ensure that the military doesn't perform the guarantor role because it's not necessary, because the courts and the political system resolve the conflicts before the military gets called on.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Bob.
Can I just follow up? And I guess I would disagree a little bit. Of course, the classical notion of the military was to protect the frontiers. And the fact of the matter is, with the end of the Cold War, thank goodness the risks to the frontiers directly are more limited. That doesn't mean you abandon that, but of course that's the case. But I guess if you look at terrorism as it's now set up, and we see terrorism as one of the security challenges every country places, there are some aspects of it for which the military is the only one that can play a role. For instance, it's an anti-terrorist operation that NATO runs in the Mediterranean, Operation Active Endeavor, where in fact we try to interdict terrorists using boats across the Mediterranean and all the rest of it. Well, I agree that one of the principal roles of dealing with terrorism is a police function, tracking them down and identify them in a police way. I think, given the nature of the terrorist threat, the military must play a role in connection with that. There are other aspects. Both I and my colleague from the Commission talked about the fact that assisting the civilian force in civil emergency planning, if there's a disaster and all of the rest of it, it's not a security function, but it's a very legitimate function, in my view, for the military. So I think, and actually I'm not sure that that's a bad thing, taking a broader function, and that's why we try to urge this notion of having a national security concept that says, what are the roles, what are the aspects you see you military playing, and make your budget decisions, make your structure decisions on the basis of that concept. Now, it might differ from country to country, don't misunderstand me, but have a concept you can defend, and ideally take to the parliament and debate in the parliament.
Armen.
Well, I agree with what Robert's saying, but I'll turn again to the countries which are from my area, which are the countries which are in transition first, and are living in a period probably we can call it not Cold War but Cold Peace, and in a transition period. It's very important, I think, that in our countries which are developing as systems based on their tradition and culture, separate and put every department, be that military, security, in their real place according to the Constitution. So I think we will have headaches when either military or security start interfering in the areas which are not defined and controlled by the Constitution. And here it comes again to the same notion that Mr. Barrot was saying, the role of independent sort of a legal and jurisdictional system in the country that looks after that everybody behaves according to the Constitution, according to the rule. When the military is basically used not for protection or fighting the terrorists, but is using for internal purposes, for example, to crack down on opposition, that's definitely unacceptable, and that's not the European model that we'd like to adopt, and where the security, instead of being used to protect the interests of the nation and the state, and the more effort is put not on, let's say, on external or external security, but internal one, which is used as a political pressure force, that's also unacceptable.
I mean, in the countries that you're talking about, where are we now? Are we heading towards the kind of judicial independence that Monsieur Barrot referred to, or are we going backwards? And I'm thinking of countries like Uzbekistan and...
No, the thing is that I think we have to try to avoid judging people. I think we're just forgetting that it's only that 19 years after the collapse of Soviet Union. From the perspective of history, it's a very short period of time, and the achievements that the whole region has gone through on different levels, of course, different states, is huge. I think we have to, first of all, value what has been achieved, then to start just criticizing. Of course, different countries are on different stages, but the tendency at the end of the day, I think it's in the right direction. Just coming back how Europe or United States should act here, I agree with the comments that were said here, that if we raise the flag over sort of a democracy as a principle and judge people, are you democratic or not, unfortunately we're going to make mistakes. If we're going to say, are these guys good guys or bad guys, that brings me back to the early days of early 90s, when basically we were having delegations all over republics of former Soviet Union from the international institutions, including World Bank, IMF, and they were judging the current minister or prime minister as a good guy or bad, depending does he speak English or not. I mean, I think we have to be very careful, and the good judgment is, at the end of the day, and the approach should be good governance and the tendency towards positive change, rather than judging them today, are they democratic or not. Of course, in 19 years' time, moving from sort of dictatorship regime into full democracy, it's impossible. No one country could do that, even with a good European history. So I think we should judge the trend rather than the current situation.
Very interesting. Anyone from the floor? Yes, please.
Atilla Ashkar from Turkey. Although the topic is the rule of law and the military, in your opening remarks, you talked about the role of the justice system, and Mr. Barrot also used the term judiciary. I like an elaboration on the use of the term judiciary. You were taught the three powers as judiciary, legislative, and the executive. I guess you use the term judiciary in a sort of non-technical sense because that has two legs. One is the legislative by the parliament, and then the judiciary. So there was some critical remark on your part about the role of the judiciary in Turkey in the latest events. But what are the checks and balances for parliamentary regimes not to end up in fascistic organizations? And the European history, and not too long ago, with starting out with parliamentary regimes, went into very strong dictatorships in our lifetime. And how do you safeguard against it without the use of the military? I assume you use the term judiciary in a sort of loose sense, not in the more technical sense where I would separate the legislative from the judiciary.
An excellent question, Attila Bey. Did you catch all that, Monsieur Barrot?
I belong to the parliamentary power during a long time, a very long time in France. Also, I like the parliamentary power, and I think that is very important for democracy to have a good parliamentary life. I agree completely. But I think that now we need a judiciary power. But not only the judge, but for instance, it's necessary for a democracy to have some authorities, independent authorities. I give an example. For instance, for the security services, for the police, it's very important to have a protection data system with a very independent authority. And the democracy now, the life of democracy is complex, and it's not possible to have only judge. We need also, for instance, independent authority for protection data. It's very, very important. If we want have a very efficient fight against terrorism, it's absolutely necessary in the same times to have a good data protection system. I insist. And also, it's not only the justice instrument, but also other instruments, and mainly these independent protection system, data protection system. I give this example, but it's probably necessary to have also a regulation for the information system, and probably the Parliament could give its advice, its opinion about these independent authorities. Sure, the Parliament has to control these independent authorities, but I think that for the democracy of the future, we need a complex organization to manage all the facts, all the acts.
Thank you very much. I think that the question also had another dimension, which was the question of who guards the guardians, who is the ultimate arbiter of what the country can be. Perhaps, Armen, you would like to, did you follow the question about how, in the end, how do you stop one ideology becoming dominant in a country with what are the best safeguards for it? Because as I think Attila is referring to, in Turkey, the system has just has frozen up because the main forces of power cannot agree on which way to go. How can it be broken in a democratic manner? How can we break this logjam in a democratic manner? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Should the judiciary have enough power to stop the excesses of the parliamentarians? The parliamentarians are not immune to excesses either. So how, and history has shown in very recent history that parliamentarians coming to power through elections, parliaments, and then grabbing power, that violates all sorts of accepted norms. I'm not talking about Turkey in general. I'm talking in a more abstract theoretical sense. What in the new democracies of the future, including the EU, what mechanisms should you have the probable, theoretically probable excesses of the elected parliamentarians?
Yeah, I think that, well, obviously from one thing that, from your original question, the question of whether the armed forces has a role in this, and obviously Turkey is quite a clear example of one where the constitution gives a legal right to the armed forces to oversee the ideological nature of the state, and which is part of the problem we have today. And how to overcome it, of course, is something which everyone can discuss. I threw the question to you, but perhaps you're...
I do understand the question that was raised here, but that's definitely a question more to European institutions, more about adjusting and developing it further and safeguarding the ideas of the democracy and the principles of democracy and applications. When it comes to the sort of countries in transition that I'm coming from, I think we're still a bit back from that point to ask that sort of a question, because in many of our countries, I think there is no balance between different sources of power. I think I would be very happy to have in one of our countries a constitutional court that will be strong enough at the end of the day to say yes or no to presidential or parliamentary elections. In most of the cases, the courts are just a yes minister type of a yes president type of a institution. So I think making that institution strong enough to balance the power of president in most of our countries or former Soviet Union, the power of president is so dominant. So it's not balanced not only by the power of the parliament, which is another elected body, but much, much less by juridical system or the constitutional court. I think the only country that you can see the parliament is active and very sort of important is probably Ukraine, where it has become a more not a place of a debate, but most of a battlefield between several fractions. But all other republics, the power of presidency or executive is so strong that I think the path forward towards democracy is strengthening other institutions, including the free, independent press, legal system, and of course also the role of the parliament. Then after a while we will get closer to the ideal system.
Mm-hmm. Grenville, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, sorry.
No, Bob, after you.
No, go ahead.
No, I insist.
No.
Mm-hmm. Grenville, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think in the final analysis it comes down to having a constitution. I mean, it's not clear to me that the military is particularly privileged in making these sort of decisions in any sense other than the fact that they're the only guys who have tanks. That doesn't necessarily generate good decisions. I mean, ultimately, I think in a theoretical sense, this is about the Constitution. It's about the court's willingness to construe the Constitution honestly, and it's about everybody's willingness to respect that decision. That is, I mean, the court in the United States of the three branches of government is arguably the supreme branch of government. But, and this is a problem I think you have to wrestle with in Turkey, I have a very serious philosophical problem with the notion that there are unamendable clauses in the Constitution especially when the judges interpret those unamendable clauses in what I could politely describe as quite extreme ways.
Thank you, Grenville. Bob, you were...
No, why don't we go on?
Monsieur Barrot, did you want to add something?
No, the answer is the Constitution, and probably a court to survey the implementation of the Constitution. But I think that there is no absolutely model, a democratic model. We have to find every time all the balance between the powers. And a live democracy needs a lot of surveys every time. It's not absolutely definitive solution. It's a balance, very not easy to find exact balance. But I think that we have to find every time the good balance.
Thank you. Any more from the floor? I recognize the figure at the back. You have a microphone behind you.
Thank you. I'm Espen Barth Eide. I'm the Deputy Minister of Defense of Norway and a civilian, by the way. From that role, I've been thinking quite a lot about this philosophical point, and I very much support Mr. Byford's line here that we have to be on an eternal quest to limit the role of the military in the eternal affairs of the state, and that's very much the quest for the victory of the strong arm of the law over the law of the strong arm. And I do think that we, as the West, need to recognize that within the logic of the so-called global war on terror, we may have been sending signals to countries in transition which have blurred this basic principle. So I think to keep sort of a clear delineation is very important and is part of the role of those in place to look after the civilization of the use of force. That said, there are, of course, cases, as Mr. Simmons says, where you simply have to draw on resources which do not exist anywhere else but in the military. That could be as simple as explosive ordnance personnel, which are more competent normally in a military organization than elsewhere. What is crucially important when we talk about the constitutional point is that there must be absolute clear rules for who can call for this, and it must not be the military. It must be civilian authority through the police and justice structure that initiates the initiative to bring a military resource into the picture if that is necessary. I think very much there is where we find the practical application of the very fundamental principle of a clear delineation between the two sources of power. And if we are not clear on this, we're sending a wrong signal to countries who really need to have a clear signal on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more remarks from the floor? Questions? Yes, please.
Mr. Simmons pointed out, or touched on something.
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, Fred Starr, Central Asia Caucasus Institute. Mr. Simmons pointed out something extremely important, namely that in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and in Russia itself, the ministries of internal affairs have their own substantial military force. The worst abuses of democratic principles throughout the region have occurred exactly from the use of those Ministry of Internal Affairs forces. I'm wondering if any member of the panel, or for that matter, any member of the forum here, has any notion of how those Ministry of Internal Affairs forces could be subjected to the same kind of normal discipline which you correctly expect of the military proper.
Thanks very much. Bob?
Well, I think there are two aspects. I think, first of all, this national security strategy I talked about ought to include those institutions. Because I think the first step is to define what their role is and what their role is not. In my own country, we don't have what you call a gendarme. In European countries, you do. But in the countries that do, the role of the gendarme is clearly defined. So I think the first step is, what is the role of the military? What is the role of the interior forces if you must retain them? And frankly, It's not just interior. You often in countries have ministries of the interior, ministries of national security, border security. Do they need all of those, or shouldn't they consider consolidating them to some degree? The second is, and that's what we've just been talking about, and it goes to the core of the title of this panel, rule of law. To me, the rule of law is, whether it's enforced by parliaments, judiciary, and we have lots of models, is that there is a norm that has been defined and that these actions can be measured against. And that, in fact, in general, the government, all three branches, believe they have to follow it. Now, that's not perfect. It's not perfect in our own countries. But that obligation is something that I think has to be developed. And there's no one-size-fits-all model, but is the core of it. That, in fact, there is a basis of law and procedure that have to be followed. And we've all paid a price when that hasn't happened, frankly.
Thank you. Any more remarks, questions from the floor? Okay, well, I think we're coming up to the 12 o'clock mark, and I'd like to just summarize, I think, what has been a very productive meeting. I think we've come across with, no one has argued about anything about moving back to any kind of military rule. We're all very clear on the goal is civilian control of armed forces and the rule of law, and that we've clearly said that the military can have an internal role as well as an external role. We've also, on the goals side, we've also said that there is no one model, that everyone can choose their own set of balances, and that nobody should be picking good guys and bad guys as they approach it from the outside, but the aim should be good governance. Plenty of strategies to be getting on with. The definitions of the constitutional powers and the necessity for outsiders to be consistent, the necessity for an independent judiciary, the need to define the principles of behaviors for security forces, and the absolutely almost confusing variety of armed forces in all these countries that we're dealing with, all need to be taken into account in any approach. The whole idea of how this can be done was perhaps once summarized for me in a fax I once received from the Turkish armed forces in the 1990s, when the European process was just beginning. And it was the first steps. And I do believe there is a trend of decreasing involvement in Turkish political affairs by the armed forces, despite all appearances. And in those days, there were obviously a debate within the armed forces, because they sent a long fax saying, look, what is this discussion about? We in Turkey have our own traditions and the way we do things, and it's we don't question, for instance, the role of the very undemocratic nature of royal families in Europe. And perhaps this should be a way of looking at us too. Which is something I've never seen taken into account in European Union approaches to Turkey, but it just goes to show that at least perceptions and variegated approaches might be possible, although I don't think there are many other militaries around the world which would compare themselves to royal families. And I think that the note takers, by the look of it, are going to take up, be able to give us a full list of all the other ideas we've had for promoting the rule of law and the definition and qualification of the military. And I thought one of the most interesting ideas I heard was the idea that we should be training civilians to understand military matters and moving that into the NGO sector as well. I thought that's a very important thing, which doesn't happen nearly enough. And if there's any other final comments from the panel? I'd just like to ask you to remain here and sitting in the plenary session. The final plenary will be starting in about 2 minutes, and they'll just be moving things around on the stage, and then we can move to the next stage. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.